We're starting our new unit today, and that is on cell transport. So in the last unit, we talked all about the cell and all the different parts of the cell and what the jobs of a cell could be, right? And I mentioned the fact that cells really all have different jobs depending on where they are and what they look like. So we talked about the fact that your DNA stores your genetic information, and then your ribosomes take that information and they make proteins out of it, right? Really important part of cell function is making proteins. Makes you think that DNA in the nucleus is probably the most important part of the cell. That's probably what you learned before, right? The nucleus is the boss of the cell. Well, I don't think that that's true. I actually think of the nucleus as being very important, but the nucleus is really just a storage area for your DNA. Its job is to protect your DNA. What's actually controlling what goes on in the cell is actually the cell membrane. And that's what we're going to start talking about today. The cell membrane is the outer portion of the cell. And why is the cell membrane so important? Well, that's the way that the cell communicates with the outside world, right? A cell is a living structure. It's a living organism, and it has to function in an environment. And how does it know when to make certain proteins? How does it know when to turn stuff off and turn stuff on? Well, the way it knows is through the cell membrane, and that's what we're going to talk about today a little bit. So let's get started. So what is the cell membrane? Well, the cell membrane is essentially the structure which surrounds the cell, and it essentially encompasses the boundary of the cell. It's what keeps everything inside, and it gives shape to the cell. But more importantly, it controls what goes in and out. And it's actually made up of something called a lipid bilayer, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. But it's a semi-permeable membrane. And what that means is some stuff can get through, but not everything can. And our cell membrane's job is to control what goes in and what comes out. And it does that a couple different ways. And we're going to start talking a little bit about the structure of the cell membrane today. So if you take a look at this image here, this shows you what the cell membrane looks like. It's a lipid bilayer. So we're going to talk about that. Like I said, lipid is a fat, and we learned all about that in the unit on macromolecules. Bi means two, so it's a double layer of fats, and then it has these proteins that are embedded in that layer. And those proteins are extremely important. So what we're going to talk about now is we're going to talk a little bit more about these lipids. Okay, so this cell membrane is made up of this lipid bilayer, or actually more appropriately, it's a phospholipid bilayer. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means. So what you see here is a picture of what a phospholipid looks like. A phospholipid has two parts. The phosphate part is the head part. That's the top of it. And that is made up of, it's made up of something called a phosphate group, which was phosphorus and oxygen and hydrogen, and it actually attaches, or it likes water. It loves water, and we call it hydrophilic. Philo or philo, like Philadelphia, means love. The lipid part is this bottom part here, which is this double tail. It's these two fatty acids. These are nonpolar. These are the fatty parts, and these do not like water, and that is the hydrophobic portion. Phobia means to fear. Hydro means water. So hydrophilic means it loves water. Hydrophobic means it doesn't like water. And what you end up with is this double layer of fats and phosphates because of the way a cell is set up. So let's just talk a little bit more about that. So if you take a look here, what you see is something that should hopefully look familiar to you. This is a picture of a lipid. This is a fat, and it is a triglyceride. It's made up of a glycerol molecule attached to 3 fatty acids. So that's what you're already familiar with. That's what you're used to hearing when you hear a fat. Well, we're talking about a different kind of fat today. There's more than one type of fat. This is a triglyceride. This is a phospholipid. So when you look at this, a phospholipid actually has a phosphate head, which is hydrophilic, which loves water, right? So I'm going to draw a little heart here. It's kind of a messed up heart. And then we have what it is this phosphate group attached to 2 fatty acids. So it's a lot like a triglyceride. A triglyceride has 3 fatty acids. This only has 2 fatty acids. So it has a 2 fatty acid tail attached to a phosphate group. And the fatty acid tail does not like water. It actually is hydrophobic. So what you end up with is a scenario where this molecule actually will move depending on if water is present. So let me just erase a couple things here. So let's say I have water around. Okay, so let's say there's water over here. Let's say this is a puddle of water. What's going to happen is this hydrophobic portion is not going to want to be near it, so it's actually going to turn away. And it's going to reorient itself so that the hydrophilic part, the part that likes the water, is going to move towards the water. And then let's say I were to move this water, right? And I move the water over here. Well, now this molecule is going to change again, and it's going to reorient itself so the part that likes the water is close to the water, and the part that doesn't like the water is towards the inside. So how do we end up with this bilayer? Well, the reason why we end up with this bilayer is because in a cell, outside of the cell, we actually have water. There's a lot of water outside of the cell. So this is all water here. And there's also water inside the cell. The cytoplasm is mostly water. So what you end up with is a scenario where, so let's say like this side, let's say this was oriented like that. What would happen is as soon as it came into contact with this water, it would change its orientation and turn away from it. So you end up with a scenario where the water molecules on the outside and the inside of the cell make this layer become a double layer. So you end up with something that looks like this, because the hydrophobic part, which doesn't like the water, is on the inside, and then the hydrophilic part that does like the water is on the outside. And then you have these proteins that are embedded that allow things to go in and out, which is what we're going to talk a little bit more about. So what you end up with is inside here we have this fatty inside. It's a lot like an Oreo cookie, if you've ever seen an Oreo cookie before, right? An Oreo cookie has the cookie outside, which when you dunk it in the milk, it absorbs the milk, right? It gets soggy, but the middle part never gets soggy because it's made of fat, right? The Oreo has trans fats in the middle. It's a lot like this. So this hydrophobic part stays in the middle, and it causes a boundary, so things can't just get in and out. It prevents things from getting in and out, so if things want to get in and out, they have to go through these openings, which are proteins. Okay, let's go a little farther into the content here, and then we'll finish up for today. Couple things about these proteins. There's actually two types of proteins which you're going to find in the cell membrane. There are cell proteins which are called integral proteins, and there are proteins which are called peripheral proteins. Integral means it's important or it's inside. So integral is inside, and an integral protein is completely embedded inside that membrane. And its job is going to be to let things in and out. So think of the integral proteins as doorways. Peripheral proteins are on the outside. So if I say peripheral vision, you might already know that means vision to the outside of your scope of vision, right? So your peripheral vision is to the outside of your visual field. So peripheral means to the outside. So what goes on here is these are proteins that stay on the outside of the cell, and they act as essentially receptors, and they cause different processes to happen. And that's what I was talking about in the beginning of this lecture. So if I go back to my image here, right, and I take a look at what's going on here, what I see is I have an integral protein right here. And the integral protein is like a doorway. When it opens, things can get into the cell or leave the cell. Peripheral proteins, on the other hand, they would attach to the outside of the cell. So they would kind of be attached to the outside like this. And what would happen to them is they would get triggered. So maybe there's a receptor here, and a molecule is going to attach to it, and that's going to trigger a response, which is going to open this gate. So the peripheral proteins are how the cell communicates with the outside world. So integral proteins are embedded, and they are throughout the entire membrane. The peripheral proteins just stay to the outside. And we're going to finish up here with the last two parts of the cell membrane. So in the cell membrane, we also have cholesterol. So we talked about cholesterol in the last unit when we talked about fats, right? So cholesterol is a type of waxy fat, and I said it can be dangerous if you have too much of it in your blood, but it's very important. And its job is it actually gives some structure to the membrane. The cell membrane is like a bubble. It's like a soapy bubble, and it could pop very easily. So think of cholesterol as like the glue or the mortar that holds the cell membrane together. So I'm going to go back to my image again that I drew. So where would the cholesterol be? Well, the cholesterol you would find, I'll make the cholesterol this orange color, it would be kind of embedded in the cell membrane. You would just kind of find it in here. And it would really just provide some extra structural support and prevent this cell membrane from breaking apart. So the cholesterol is very important for structural component of the cell membrane. And then finally, it keeps it firm and strong without being too permeable. And then finally, we have carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are sugars, but what they do is they attach to the outside of the cell and they allow cells to identify each other. So you may have heard of antibodies before, right? Antibodies are what fight off the virus. They attach to the carbohydrate markers on the outside of a cell. So that's how cells know one from another. Our cells don't have eyes. How do they know whether a cell belongs? How do I know if it's a bacteria cell that invaded or one of my body cells? Well, the way it can tell is with these carbohydrates, and they attach to the outside of the cell membrane, often to the proteins, and they are how the cells identify each other. A really good way to think of it is if you've ever seen a blind person before and they're trying to identify a person and what they look like, a lot of times they'll feel their face, right? They'll take their hand and they'll feel the person's face, and then they'll construct an image in their head of what the person looks like. Well, that's essentially what cells do. They bump into each other, and the carbohydrates on the outside of the cell is what they use to identify each other. So if I go back to my image here, the carbohydrate would be something like this. Let me just get rid of this water here. The carbohydrate would be most likely attached, let's say, to this protein here, and it would have a certain shape to it, and that would be how this cell is identified by another one of your cells. Thank you very much.